trail and ultra runners, what is going on? Welcome to another episode of the KoopCast. As always, I am your host, Coach Jason Koop, and on this episode of the podcast, we explore further the concept of durability as it applies to ultra running. Durability is one of these emerging physiological concepts that describes how our maximum performances, like a time trial, or our maximum physiology, like VO2 max, deteriorate after some sort of fatiguing event, let's say a 2-hour run or a 50 kilometers of running. Coaches and physiologists alike are appreciating more and more the importance of durability in ultra running, and it has the opportunity to be one of, if not the most important variables that could correlate with performance. And as it turns out, it's also something that we can specifically train for. Now, with that as a backdrop, on the podcast today is Michele Zanini, who is the head of strength and conditioning, as well as a physiologist for the Italian Triathlon Federation, as well as a PhD candidate at Loughborough University. He has fleshed out, or at least he's trying to flesh out, this concept of durability through his academic endeavors, as well as his work with athletes. Also on the podcast today, we will hear from coaches Adam Ferdinandson, Fred Sabator Pastor, as well as our strength and conditioning expert, Sarah Scazzaro, on how we can use different training interventions, including potentially strength training, to enhance durability. Okay, with that out of the way, I am getting right out of the way. Here's my conversation with Michele Zanini, all about durability in ultra running.
Okay, cool. We'll get into it, man. I appreciate you joining me. I appreciate you joining me today. But kind of before we get into things, the listeners will always already have heard an intro on you. But can you kind of go over just a little bit of your background and what your area of research focuses on?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the invite. Really appreciated it. And I'm a listener to the podcast as well. So excited to be involved. So my background from a research perspective and practice perspective comes from running. I was a runner and then started doing a degree in sport and exercise science, and then eventually got more and more involved into the physiology side of it, try to understand how training occurs and how can we enhance performance via training and monitor it through physiological testing. I've been involved in practice with high-performing athletes, mainly at the start of my journey as an intern in Kenya with Claudio Berardelli, and then went back a few years later and worked with Renato Canova on the strength and conditioning side of it. So that his philosophy and approach on training and endurance performance really shaped how I see the applied physiology research that I currently do. And then on the back of it, in 2020, I started a PhD related to the topics of durability. And I know that you've been having guests before on the topic, running economy, and how can we try to delay fatigue, so enhance durability via training interventions. And we focused on strength training as a potential strategy for that.
Well, one of the things that I've kind of just in the background research that I've done that I've really come to appreciate about your work is that it's directly applicable to what you can do from a training perspective, because you have both the performance side and then also the intervention side of things as well, kind of married up together, so to speak. Meaning, if we know that these certain physiological parameters are important for performance, that's always one thing. But it's an entirely different thing to say, how do we actually improve those things? And that's what, coaches and physiologists and athletes all alike are trying to chase around, right? Trying to improve the variables that matter the most, and the variables that may not matter as much might be something that they focus on at some other point in the year, or maybe not even focus on at all. And I think there's just a lot of practical elements of a lot of the research that you've done that we're going to start to weed through.
Yeah, I think that is the main driver for me to do research, at least in the applied physiology side of it. There are other areas which I'm interested in, but if you speak about performance, then the final goal is how can I find a way to get better. So that brings me back to a conversation I had with one of the athletes I was training with when I was doing my master thesis. So it was a thesis about the use of foot pod power meter stride and basically the reliability of that. And there was this elite 400-meter athlete that she did Olympic championship, Olympic Games, World Championships, and etc. And the question when I explained what we were doing was, okay, so will that make me faster? So that is the one of the points in my research experience that made me focus more and more towards the applicability of what I do and making sure that what we research, we investigate, can have then a translation to the practice that has done with athletes from a physiological perspective, and then an effect on training eventually if we want to measure that.
Yeah, because it always has to drive down to what can the athlete actually do to improve. And sometimes that gets lost in research and pedantic arguments and the nuance of things. And you absolutely need a lot of that. And you need a lot of that you need a lot of that specificity in order to really understand things. But at the end of the day, athletes just want to know what do I do? Do I strength train or do I not? Right? Sometimes it's very binary like that. Do I do intervals or do I not? Do I do high intensity intervals or do I not do high intensity intervals? Sometimes it can be, kind of boiled down to something that really is that simple. So we're gonna first talk about a paper that you wrote about durability. I'll direct the listeners to two previous podcasts that I did on this very same topic with Nick Berger and Ed Marnder. There'll be some links to the show notes in there. But I've considered this, out of all of the kind of physiological phenomenon that we studied, I consider this one of the newer ones, and one that we don't have the best working definition of, if you were to describe it to people, and also the best definition of how to actually measure these types of things.
Mm-hmm.
And so since you're at the leading edge of this, being kind of early to the game to it, just to refresh the listeners who might have not listened to those podcasts, or it's been a while since they have listened to those podcasts, just describe it in your own mind, or in your own words, what durability is, and then why is it actually important? Going back to that original theme that we were talking about, why is it actually important for endurance athletes to pay attention to?
Yeah, sure. I think from a terminology perspective, there's a lot of debate, or two terms that are used at the moment related to physiological changes occurring during prolonged exercise. So that would be the way that we would describe durability. So a change in speed, power output, or physiological determinants due to accumulated fatigue during a continuous bout of exercise. Now, that is one of the definitions. And then if you look at papers recently published by Andy Jones, for example, he defines the same as physiological resilience. So at the moment, we have these two terms that they may mean something slightly different, but it's not that clear. So I think at the moment they can be kind of used interchangeably. We will hopefully eventually come up to a more clear definition of that. And we are actually currently working with Ed Maunder, Andy Johnson, and a few other people on to developing a terminology which can be used in the future for that. But yes, a simple way to describe it is any changes in performance outcomes or physiological outcomes that occur due to fatigue during prolonged exercise.
And from a practical standpoint, what would that actually look like? Like, how would an athlete see that if they're running a marathon or an ultra marathon? What would they actually notice in the data that they can just acquire through their GPS watch?
For example, from running, it's quite easy to see a heart rate drift as you continue doing exercise. That is due to many factors, but let's leave the underpinning of it to the side for a moment. What you usually see is a steady speed and an increase of heart rate. So that means that your physiological demands are increasing at the same speed, and therefore there's a decoupling between heart rate and speed. It can occur on the other way around, so you maintain the same heart rate and the speed decreases, but the effect is the same. You haven't decoupled between physiology and performance or speed, which will eventually cause you to either slow down or cessate the exercise altogether.
And one of the paper that we're about to discuss that you're an author on, it tried to get to the answer of, does this actually matter? Which I always honestly like to start with whenever we start to read research. We have a research newsletter, the group of which we're going to meet with just after this call, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we're constantly asking ourselves is, does this actually matter? Like, if we see an improvement in X, is that meaningful in some way from a training or racing perspective? And many times that's not the case, or it's at least unknown. And so you're trying to get at the heart of this with some of the research that we're going to talk about in this next paper. Can you just describe generally like what you were looking at, who the subjects are and things like that, and then we can start to get to what the actual findings were?
Yeah, sure. So with the paper you've been mentioning, we wanted to look into how running economy specifically, changes due to continuous exercise. Now, to me, specificity is very important. So we do have the element of intensity, which needs to be appropriate. We wanted to specifically target the demands of a marathon. So the speed was targeted to be closely resembling that. That would be normally for highly trained athletes in the heavy intensity domain, so between the first and second threshold. We can get into some of the details if needed, but I think if we say in zone 2 or zone 3, depending on the 3 or 5 zone model, that makes it quite clear. And we wanted to have a duration which at least could have been meaningful to provide some information. So 90 minutes was okay compromise between, okay, we have a duration which is relatively long, and we don't risk to have 50% of our participants dropping out because the duration is too long. So if we were to do 2 hours and a half at that intensity, would have been very hard for most athletes, and probably the power of the study would be much lower, and that would have consequences from a statistical perspective and results perspective, really.
Yeah, and I appreciate the number of athletes that you actually put through this. So 50 or north of 50, 51 male runners, correct?
Yeah, 44. They finished in 44, started 51.
Yeah, and some of them quite good. So 31-minute 10K was kind of the good group. And then the less good group, I mean, they're still very good runners. The 41-minute 10K would be the comparison group. So when you took the run, first off, describe the testing protocol a little bit more, and then what did you actually find?
Yeah. So what we did was initially having this 44. Well, the study was the design of the study, and the protocol was the same for everyone. So we just got them do the initial step test to measure threshold and VO2 max. And then on a separate day, we got them coming at 8 a.m. So standardized time of the day, diet and exercise prior to the test. And then they ran for 90 minutes where we collected the running economy and other data every 15 minutes. They were running on a treadmill at a speed which was corresponding to the first threshold. It was roughly 80% VO2 max for the athletes. I don't remember on top of my head the speed, but it can be found on the paper. And we measured the changes in energy cost and oxygen cost, which are two ways of measure running economy between time points. So at 15, 30, 45, and so forth minutes until 90 minutes into the trial. And then from there, we divided the groups based on 10K performance as athletes that were running below 33 minutes, 10 kilometers, and between 45 and 38 minutes, 10 kilometers. So that left a 5 minutes gap in between, which we deemed to be appropriate to have a clear divide between the groups, and compared the changes in oxygen and energy cost between groups.
So before we go on, the fact that you're looking at both oxygen cost, energy cost, I think is something worth discussing. especially because we are talking about something that's in a relatively high performance setting. Most of the listeners will kind of think potato between those two, kind of between those two variables. But can you describe a little bit more in detail as to why, or actually like how they're different, and what's the significance of those differences in this context?
Yes, yeah, it is very much a physiologist kind of topic. So what we have in the description or the use of running economy is it can be expressed as oxygen or energy. So the difference is with oxygen, we have an integrated view of the changes in oxygen demands and substrate utilization, which is given by RER. Whereas with energy, that change in RER is already included in the measure. So what we've seen with the same, what one of my supervisors saw a few years ago with Andy Shaw, which is now the senior physiologist of British Athletics, was that there was a difference in the accuracy of the measure of running economy between oxygen and energy cost. And energy cost seem to be a better way to express running economy, a more accurate, appropriate way to express the underlying metabolic demands of the body, because it's sensible to changes in speed, which is not the case for oxygen cost. So what we wanted to look into from a research perspective in our case was, is it the same if we express durability as energy cost or oxygen cost? And if there's any difference, to what extent is this different relevant for applied settings?
From a practical point of view, once again, kind of drilling it back down to the listeners, why
Yes.
would somebody see a drift in one and not the other? Or why would somebody see a larger drift in one versus the other?
It would mainly be due to changes in substrate utilization. So if you have a change in area because you're depleting glycogen, you will have a higher reliance on fat, which requires more energy. So you'd see a higher drift in oxygen cost compared to energy cost because there's this difference in accounting or not accounting for substrate utilization. Now, what we found was that actually with these specific settings, differences were so minor that they are kind of irrelevant. There was a difference of 0.1% between the two, which I think it was kind of unexpected, although the changes in substrate utilization in our study was very limited. We do have data for other studies that have been done in the past on the marathon, and in that case, they have a difference which reached about 2%. So from the start to the end of a marathon, the participants, athletes would change by maybe 15% for oxygen cost and 13% for energy cost. So there's a slightly larger difference, but I would say that overall, there's a quite minor influence of the unit used to describe running economy between energy and oxygen cost to be worried about from a practical perspective.
Would it be a reasonable assumption to say as the duration of the event goes up, the potential for those to kind of deviate from one another or separate from one another would go up? Is that a reasonable assumption
Absolutely.
that people are kind of teasing through? Yeah, that's my understanding of it as well.
Yes, it would be different between type of exercise, of course. In the marathon, if you have a marathon runner that is, let's say, high performing, maybe sub 2 hours 30, sub 2 hours 20 in a male athlete, the respiratory exchange ratio would be around 1 for the whole duration of the race. But that doesn't really matter because there's no drop in RER and no change in substrate utilization. Whereas for trail runners or ultra distance runners, it will probably matter much more because of the higher reliance on fat due to the lower intensity of the exercise.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a good distinguishing point because we're always in the ultramarathon world. This has been a theme that we come back to almost every podcast. Is in many cases, we're taking research that was done in a marathon setting just because it's just more prevalently studied. And we're trying to expand the interpretation of that into a longer event. And sometimes that expansion holds true, and sometimes that expansion does not hold true. And that's part of the person who's interpreting the study or the intervention or whatever to actually kind of figure out. But that's neither here nor there. Okay, so what did you find out? You have good runners, and you had kind of more. Yeah. I keep describing them as less good runners. I can't remember exactly how the paper described them, but how did they actually differ in terms of the things that you were measuring?
What we found was basically, as you would expect intuitively, that the higher performing runners had a lower drift in economy, so they had a better running economy durability compared to the lower performing athletes. So we define them as high or low performing based on that 10K performance. I don't remember the exact numbers. It could be something like 4.5 versus 2.2, 2.3% change from 15 minutes to 90 minutes. It's basically like a 50% difference in the upward drift in economy between the athletes that perform around 31 minutes in 10K versus the athletes that perform about 41 minutes in 10K.
And so what comes first here in your estimation? Let's put kind of more of a practitioner's hat on, right? Are the better runners more durable because they're better runners, or is the greater durability enable them somehow to become better runners? Or is that not even the right way to think about it? Because that's the final part of the interpretation on these, is a lot of times you start to see these physiological phenomenon differ from one group to the next, and you always have to decide where the chicken and the egg come, and what order they actually what order they actually like come in. So in your mind's eye, since you've been studying this, what do you have to say to that? What is causing any of this phenomenon to actually be different between these two groups?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't have a definite answer, and I would say it's a bit of both, which is hiding away from it.
Oh.
It's tricky because what you would need to answer the question would be an intervention study, in my opinion, or a very long longitudinal study looking at that. So if you do an intervention and you get athletes doing a specific type of exercise for an X amount of months, then you can see the effect of it. If we just take a cross-section study and compare athletes from different background, performance level, whatever variable we want, you can only say, well, this is how the groups differ, but you cannot say why. If I think about some world-class athletes and their durability, some of the case studies that have been brought forward recently, there's one about two pro cyclists, the winner of the 2016 Giro d'Italia and the 2017 Giro Rosa, which they demonstrated how their durability, this being a decrease in maximum mean power throughout a stage, was far higher than any other measure taken before from other athletes, even from World Tour cyclists. So they didn't change their maximum mean power output up to about 80% into the stage. That's one. And then very recently, Magnus Ditlev, world-class Ironman triathlete, was measured, and his physiological changes during a simulated Ironman were tracked every, I think, about 30 minutes. And here again, from an economy perspective, he only changed by 1.5, 2% after the Ironman, whereas there were no differences in cycling efficiency. So that to me says, well, if you are a world-class athlete, you need to have good durability. Now, the question you made is, do we need to train for that and that is what makes the performance better, or is it something that the athlete already has and it can't really be developed? I would say you can train it. And I say that because if you take anybody that is just running 5-10K races, let's say, you can measure their economy, you can measure their VO2 max, and you can measure their threshold, and you should be able to pretty well estimate their marathon performance. However, if you ask them to do a marathon, they're not going to be able to finish it because they never experienced that exposure to volume, running distance, and etc. To me, that is one of the factors that fits into the puzzle and gets developed through long runs, through long exercise, through specific type of training sessions that we all know improve marathon performance, but up to now, physiological, we couldn't really explain why.
Yeah. And I mean, here's where I kind of come back to it too. First off, to kind of expand on what I had originally asked you in terms just in terms of what comes first, the chicken or the egg. I'll go back to the previous podcasts that I did with Ed Marnder and Nick Berger, and they both believe after studying this phenomenon that it is a little bit of both. First, it's a natural byproduct of training, and probably the biggest hammer that you have in all of endurance physiology is just volume. So the runners and the athletes with just a higher amount of volume who've been training at high volumes for a longer period of time, decades and not just years, they tend to demonstrate better durability as a byproduct of all of that, of the cumulative amount of all of that work over many, many years. So that's the first kind of component of it, is that we see more experienced runners that have been training at high volumes for long periods of time have better durability. And there's kind of no shortcut to that, right? That's just,
Yeah.
You just have to be in the game for that long. And the second thing that they're this is more of a postulation than what they actually see in case studies and things like that, because it's harder to actually tease out. And this goes to your idea of an intervention study. Is there a way to deliberately focus on this physiological aspect? And we've kind of like the analogy that I kind of that I always give is, we know how to push on the VO2 max button pretty well by now. There have been any number, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies that have analyzed volume and interval programs and the duration of the interval and how long do you have to be under a certain type of load and what the combination of work to recovery can be and things like that. And there's a reason why everybody's like quote unquote VO2 max workouts are all roughly the same, because it's the combination of all of that research over many years that have kind of given us some best practices. And sure, there's, coaches get in these stupid debates about, is a 1 minute interval better or a 2 minute interval better, or whatever kind of small like deviation. And, there's some value to that, but by and large, they're 90% the same. But then they come back to, okay, are there actually interventions that we can do? And the resounding answer from them, and I'd like to hear your comment on this as well, is we kind of don't know, but it makes sense that if you concentrated some portion of harder work or the workload in a fatigued state, regardless of how you created that fatigue, whether it's, a 90-minute run, which would be the example of the research that you just went through, or a 3-hour run or a set of intervals or whatever, if you kind of created some fatiguing state and then did something deliberate in a fatigue state, that might enhance this component of durability, just like we can enhance VO2 max development with specific protocols and intervals and interventions and things like that.
Okay, Coach Adam. So what do you think about this overall concept of durability, and maybe give us a practical example of how you would accentuate it with an athlete that you're coaching?
Yeah, so durability is something that I think about every day when I'm programming schedules for athletes and when we think about what we're going to do over the next months or years. And even though it's kind of a newer buzzword in the space, it's something that we've all had a more intuitive sense about for a long time. You want to run 100 miles, it helps to slow down less, some sort of concept like that. So to program it, honestly, with most of my athletes, I probably don't do anything where like a workout where this is the durability workout or something like that. There's a time and a place for that. I think it's somewhat advanced, I would call it. So it's not something I deploy often. one of our number one tools that we're always going to have is training volume. It's one of the reasons maybe we do training camps or leverage other ways to make things a little bit more dense, stacked closely together or harder. But number one tool is volume to spoil some of the later tidbits.
I'm always reminded from a programming perspective, probably one of the oldest workouts that a lot of marathon runners will recognize, and that's the progression run. So a run that gets faster over time to the point where you're doing the most intense part of the run at the point of most fatigue. And there may be some component of that that accentuates durability. And I think what a lot of runners need to kind of like reconcile in their head is, are you building your overall capacity or are you building something like very specific? So if you're building overall capacity, you would typically want to do the hardest parts of a run when you're the freshest possible, because that's going to give you the best outcome for that. But if you wanted to build more quote unquote durability in a way, you could shift some of that hard work towards the end of the run. And I do this with a number of my elite athletes where we'll program tempo and steady state, mainly those two workouts. So threshold or slightly easier than threshold, closer towards the end of the run as opposed to the beginning, knowing that we either have to reduce the volume of intensity because they're pre-fatigued, or just set the expectations differently in terms of how fast they can run or the intensity that they can maintain for those for those specific runs. I wouldn't say that it's a workout that I deploy a lot. Like maybe it's 10% of the actual, it's maybe like 10% of the total amount of time that we're spending at any one particular intensity we'll do in a fatigued state. So I hope that like sets the context for how like quote unquote important it is, because Adam, as you mentioned, there are other ways that you can actually accentuate it. Kind of going along in parallel, this is a relatively newer concept to actually like test for. And we test for it for two reasons. Is one, to see if we can actually improve it with certain interventions. And the second thing is to actually see if it's actually, or to actually make sense of, is it actually meaningful? We think it's meaningful for performance, but a lot of times we have to test people's different durabilities and see if they're better or worse athletes. And Fred, I was hoping that you could, kind of shed some light on that concept since you've got a lot of experience in this area.
Yeah, and then for this testing side of durability, a lot of the research has been done with sports in which it is very important to perform at a very high intensity towards the end, like road cycling. Road cycling is probably the one in which it has been done the most. And like you want to do the final climb going very fast compared to trail and ultra running, in which you may be pushing at the end, but the intensity at the end is usually actually can be slower than at the beginning because of the accumulated fatigue, right? So then in those types of sports, the typical test is to go as hard as you can for like 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes at the end of a workout. That is something that we can still deploy in trail running, but doing that hard test at the end. So for example, wherever you do, like if you have a hill climb that you use for testing, doing it at the end of a workout as hard as you can, that could be one thing. However, one thing that I tend to use a lot is more like when going by RPE. So like an athlete is supposed to be keeping the same RPE. They run a loop, and the first climb, they repeat it at the end. So they may go out for 3 hours, they like warm up, do the first climb, then they go, they run, and then at the end, they repeat that same climb. The goal is to be doing it with the same RPE, all that, and then we check like what is the change in the different variables that we can see. First of all, time of the climb, right? Like did they run more on the first time and then walk more the second time? And then like was the heart rate different? We can check like first of all time, which would be performance, and then what are the things that are influencing that time.
Yeah, and a lot of people who are familiar with like the Grand Tour stage race cycling, they can see the way that this actually plays out in a race where the entire peloton can make it up the first climb. Maybe 80% of the peloton can make it up the second climb. 60% of the peloton makes it up the third climb. And then you're left with the leaders at the ultimate or the penultimate climb. And that's usually where the kind of the more decisive moves are made, especially at the really tough mountain stages. And in the research world, what they've tried to do is kind of recreate that in a more realistic scenario by doing either a fixed amount of work, let's say it's 1,000 kilojoules of work or something like that, or a fixed amount of time at a certain intensity, and then do some sort of performance test afterwards. So you're testing the performance test in this fatigue state after a certain amount of work or a certain task. as opposed to that same type of performance in an unfatigued state and seeing what the actual difference is.
And I kind of want to get your take on like both of those elements, both this volume element and also this specific intervention that may or may not, get teased out in the next several years.
Yeah, I agree. And as we were mentioning before, I think intuitively every coach that does training for marathon or long running events knows that you need your long runs to improve your marathon. Now, I think what we're trying to do is try to understand why, what occurs in the body, and how your physiology changes during exercise. And then the next step from here onwards is, can we try to improve that? To me, specificity is very important. And I come from the methodology of Canova, which is very much onto specificity. Right. You have to do your long runs and you have to do it long enough and fast enough. So that is the key, in my opinion, to have a very good performance in the marathon, even at the very first attempt. And then if you blend it back to the durability, I think that is one of the key aspects. There will be probably protocols or ideas on specific training that can be done to optimize durability enhancements. But at the moment, I would say that including your long runs often enough will make a difference. That is one of the other studies we did. It's not published yet, but what we did was exactly the same as the protocol we described. And we had two groups, one that had the inclusion of long runs in the training program, defined as, I think, runs longer than 90 minutes, at least 3 times a month. And then the other group didn't have any long runs defined as, and I think they had to run less than 70 minutes continuously in the previous 6 months. And what we found here again was the group that did long runs only increased their energy cost, oxygen cost, so the running economy durability by 3% in the 90 minutes, and the other group increased by 6%. So again, this is not an intervention study. It may be due to due to a lot of factors, but that is one other step pointing towards we need volume, we need continuous running to develop durability, and that is clearly linked to the best practice of development of long distance runners.
Yeah, and one of the there's this contingent of there's this contingent of athletes and coaches that want to use a lower volume approach when training for a variety of reasons. They either want to focus more on intensity, they want to they are injury adverse, right? Or they might be more susceptible to injury, and volume being one of the kind of like catalysts for injuries potentially amongst certain athletes and things like that. And there's a whole like host of motivations. And I've always thought that there's power in doing that, because we should all be advocates of a variety of intensities for any endurance athletes. But one of the things that you're missing with those low volume approaches is this very specific, I'm going a certain duration and I'm developing parts of my physiology that I can't otherwise develop unless the duration is is of a certain distance. The question is what is that need? What does that need to be? And is there a dose dependent response for increasing that duration past 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, or 5 hours? Or does it not matter after a certain point? And this is a debate that we've gotten into in the ultramarathon world. And I don't think that there's a lot of things that we can point to give us best practices or things like that, other than a lot of these case studies that we see with people that have been training for many, many years with a very high volume. They just tend to exude this quality more so than other athletes.
Yeah, I mean, I can't comment much on this, but if you look at the training practice of the best elite runners or elite endurance athletes in general, they all have very high training volumes. Now, from a running perspective, the main limitation is probably the occurrence of injuries due to the continuous load on joint bones and the eccentric damage that you get from running, particularly in trail running, if you speak about downhill running and how that affects those parameters. If you look at other sports, triathlon is an example which is very clear. You have elite triathletes that they sometimes train more than 35, more than even 40 hours per week. There's been a case study on the training habits or training background of Christian Blumenfeld, just published a couple of months ago. And the highest weekly mileage he had, or highest weekly duration he had across the three disciplines, was over 40 hours. And it's the same for many of the elite athletes I work with the Italian Triathlon Federation. We top up 32, 33, 34 hours per week regularly with the best performing athletes.
And I do think that perspective that we particularly see in triathlon, because they have three sports and they seem to be at least less injury susceptible because of that sport distribution, and you can do a lot of volume from a cycling perspective and kind of get away with it a little bit more. But I do think that looking at those volumes in that context, drilling it back to the athletes that I work with for a living, which are ultramarathon athletes, I do think that there's a valuable lesson in there in terms of how much volume can potentially be tolerated by an athlete. And in most cases, it's greater than what a lot of people think. A lot of people look at 10, 12, 14 hours per week, especially for an elite athlete, and they look at it as a lot. And then when we look at these other sports, triathlon in particular, and then also cycling to a large extent as well, we see athletes in this 25 to 30, or even, as you mentioned, 40-hour category that are remarkably successful. And then you also kind of see the corollary of what's the floor that you need to have to be able to train at in order to be remotely competitive. Meaning, what is the hourly commitment that is absolutely required in order to compete at the highest level? We also see very high amounts of that as well, not only just looking at the peak volume, but looking at like kind of the minimum viable amount of time that's necessary to be competitive.
So Fred, I want to talk a little bit about how volume becomes extremely important when we talk about how we can accentuate an athlete's durability. In the earlier interjection with Coach Adam, he mentioned that, this is one of the things that we can actually press on the most from a training perspective to enhance durability, as opposed to coming up with some sort of fancy convoluted progression run or something like that. And this is something that the research has actually teased out a little bit. And I was wondering if you could comment on that a little bit further in terms of what role volume actually plays in an athlete being more or less durable.
Yeah, I think it is one of those things in which the research has been pointing to that direction. Most of this research, again, being done with cyclists or in cycling, but then when they have seen what are the training variables that correspond to better durability with these athletes, usually like under 23 and professional cyclists, what they see is that training volume, it is the main thing, the thing that is going to improve durability the most, or like the thing that correlates best with durability. Really, it's a correlation. But from this correlation and our experience as coaches, we are seeing that inference as well, that athletes that are running the higher, let's say, weekly volume, and also the higher accumulated volume over like the previous period, not just like week by week, but like accumulated, not just like for the peak weeks, right? But like for an accumulated number of weeks. The athletes that are accumulating the biggest volume are the ones that can sustain intensity better towards the end of races. And that seems to be also the case with like marathon runners on the roads.
I'm glad you mentioned the overall umbrella, because a lot of times we tend to put the focus on what is the longest long run or the longest training blocks, or what are the like biggest 2 or 3 runs that an athlete would have. But what typically produces the best adaptations is the amount of volume that you can do over long periods of time. And there's really great, and I'm going to link some of these up in the show notes now that I'm thinking about it. There's some really great case studies on endurance athletes where they have a very rich history of training. This is at the elite and the Olympic level. And what they've seen is with those particular athletes, when they just increase their low intensity volume toward the end of their career, they can actually see that career either elongated and or they actually perform better. They're not doing anything else from an interval perspective. It's the exact same person. But just by increasing that low intensity volume, they tend to have performance benefits really across the board. And so it's something that we have to focus on a lot from a coaching perspective, because there becomes this double-edged sword with it, where we know it's a potent stimulus for improvement, but we also know that it can be too much for a lot of athletes. You can't do an unlimited amount of it because of the injury susceptibility. But make no mistake, it's kind of like the best hammer that you have in your toolbox. If you have like all these things that you can do, you can always count on doing a little bit more volume to reap improvements across the board, and more specifically with durability.
I was wondering if you can kind of like comment on that component of it as well, just to kind of like add the perspective. We're not just looking at the super, highest people, but also there's kind of a floor that also exists to a larger, or to some extent, that we see in these elite groups as well.
Yes, it is tricky to point out numbers because, as we were saying, or I was pointing out, most of the high-performing athletes, they do have very high volumes. I think if you're limited in time, you can try to find strategies to optimize your training. I think training load is a good metric from a weekly perspective to look at. So if you don't have the time in the week, then you can try to have some of the sessions harder. Although we know very well that the distribution between low, medium, and high intensity, let's call it that way, it has to be primarily low intensity, a little bit of medium intensity, a little bit of high intensity, which can be equally distributed or not. And we're speaking about 70, 80, 90% of low intensity. I wouldn't be able to tell you what is the minimum volume that you need to perform well in a race. If I give you a simple example of an athlete that I've been working with for a long time, it's a age grouper, master 45 years old athlete, and he just did his first marathon last week. He ran 2 hours 32, and his training volume was about 100 kilometers per week. I think it is hard to run sub 2 hours 30 if you don't train at least 100 kilometers a week, although it very much depends on your engine. If you're super talented, let's say you're, I don't know, like a Kipchoge type of athlete, and you've never trained, you will probably still perform very well in the marathon just because of your biology. But across the board, if you say 100 kilometers a week, I think you can break the 2 hours 30. Maybe you can break the 2 hours 25. Then you probably need more volume.
Once again, I think people will resonate with that. You're talking 60, I'll convert to miles, right? 62,
Yes.
65.
Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, it's totally okay. But I think people will kind of resonate with that, like, minimum viable product. The everyday runners out there that have a job, kids, they play a lot of different roles in life and things like that. They can't train 20 hours a week just from a time availability standpoint. They can't train 200 kilometers a week, 160 miles a week, just from a time availability standpoint. But for the elite athletes out there, and I go through this whenever I take on a new athlete, I kind of drill down to how much time availability do you have? Like, do you have a minimum amount in order to kind of succeed, especially if you're kind of right on the cusp? Because there is a certain amount that required is not quite the right word, but there is a certain amount that is absolutely beneficial to have, a minimum amount that's absolutely more beneficial to have, that is not trivial, that you have to be able to dedicate to in one way or another, whether it's time dedication or effort dedication or all of the above. Okay, next, I kind of want to pivot a little bit to some research that you did that was presented at the ECSS conference. And correct me if I'm wrong, but this is unpublished, or at least it's yet to be published. Is that correct?
Yes, it's under review, so hopefully we'll be out soon.
Okay, perfect. So we're like peeling back the curtain a little bit on this, and you can divulge as much or as little as you want to. I know that there might be some restriction on this, but it has to do with strength training and endurance performance, which is another topic that we kind of keep coming back to, and also kind of dovetails into this element of durability, maybe directly and maybe tangentially. So can you go over some of that research, since it's, part of your thesis is something that you're obviously intimately involved in, and then we can try to come up with some take homes with both that and then on the durability piece as well.
Yeah, so if we speak about strength training in a broad perspective related to endurance sports and running initially, we know, at least from a scientific perspective, that strength training tends to improve endurance performance, and is mainly due to an improved economy. So again, energy cost, oxygen cost, or cycling efficiency, if you speak about cycling, together with alterations that they seem to potentially make you more durable as well. So you have an enhanced muscle tendon stiffness, which could be useful in a prolonged exercise type of exercise, and then we have an increased muscle strength, meaning that for the same load, same velocity, same speed, we would usually have we would expect to have a lesser activation of muscle fibers, because you have a higher force produced by each muscle fascicle, and therefore that should reduce the load on the number of fibers that you're using for the same speed. So if you get these from a fresh perspective to a fatigue perspective, what you'd hope to see is that there's a delay in lesser efficient type 2 fibers, and that should carry on advantages from a fatigue performance perspective. So that was the initial idea and reason why we wanted to look into the effect of strength training onto durability in running. So what we did was, again, a 90 minutes trial, slightly more intense than what we did with the first study. So it was a bit more into the heavy intensity domain, I think 10% above but 10% delta between lactate threshold 1 and 2. And we measured it before and after 10 weeks of strength training done twice a week, where we did heavy strength and plyometrics. And then we measured it. We measured the changes in economy throughout, again, every 15 minutes, and the change in performance following it. So high intensity performance following 90 minutes of running, done before and after the training intervention.
Can you describe the strength training that they were actually going through?
Yeah. So we had 2 plyometrics exercises. We do have, I think the kind of sample table is available online. I put it on my Twitter when we presented the study. And if you have it, feel free to share it on your platforms as well. It's no secret. And we did it purposely to make it readily available for runners that would just want to implement it. So the reasoning was, we want to use it in an ecologically valid way that everybody can use it in a gym or at home if they have some barbells and weights. We had 2 plyometric exercises, one horizontal and one vertical, to improve muscle tendon stiffness. And then we had 3 maximal strength exercises, a single leg press, squat, which was a half squat in most of the protocol, and then an isometric seated calf raise, and that was done mainly to improve the force generated, the capacity to generate force in an isometric perspective, due to the behavior of the calf muscle to be acting mainly isometrically when you run.
And so you use the term ecologically viable. I'm going to colloquialize that to meaning it was simple, meaning athletes who had a reasonable strength training setup or even no strength training setup could do something like this. And I guess another way to put it is I could put this in front of one of my strength training professionals and they would go, oh yeah, this is really simple programming. It's going to be remarkably effective, but we can make it more effective by just adding this, that, and the other. You were taking a really, really like a very, very simplistic approach with what you were actually prescribing for athletes. And I'll wire up that table in the show notes for anybody that actually wanted to like look at the protocol that you were taking athletes through.
Yeah, that was the idea. Keep it simple, and I wouldn't necessarily implement it like that myself because I want to have it more individualized. But we wanted to keep the exercises as simple as possible and not change them throughout the 10 weeks intervention, because otherwise we would have spent 1 to 3 weeks with athletes learning the movement instead of spending the time getting stronger.
Yeah.
So we had a 10 weeks duration constraint, which is not the problem usually with an athlete that wants to implement it regularly from today consistently throughout the next season, for example.
Yeah, perfectly reasonable time frame to deliver that strength training program. So what did you find at the end of the day?
Yeah, so what we found was we had the strength training group and we had the control group. So the difference was the strength training group implemented strength on top of running. The control group just kept running the same as before. They were matched for performance over 10K. Again, I think performance-wise, the average was about 39 minutes between groups. So decent runners, not elite or sub-elite, but still nice performance level, which it's not that easy to find in the literature. And what we found was the strength training improved running economy durability, both within the group. So the group that did strength training had a better durability after compared to before, and also between groups. So we measured the change between and after the groups, and only the group that did the strength training improved substantially, whereas the other didn't. Likewise, for time to exhaustion, that was a performance trial at the end. The athletes that did strength training improved by 35%, whereas the athletes that didn't do the strength training worsened by 8%.
People are going to think about that, and you were probably just getting into this. So I'm sorry if I'm stomping on it a little bit. People are going to think about this 35% improvement. Oh my God, that's like kind of unbelievable. But I think it might be important to describe how a time to exhaustion test kind of exaggerates those improvements and why you actually use that in research.
Yes, that was going to be my next point. It is very different using a time to exhaustion from a time trial. Time to exhaustion is how long can you sustain the effort for, the intensity for, whereas time trial is how quickly can you cover a given distance or how much speed can you put in a given time. So they are very different variables. If you have an increase in time to exhaustion by, let's say, 35% as we did, that could probably translate in improved time trial performance. So let's say a 1 kilometer performance of 5 to 10%, 5 to 7%. So it is very much in line with previous research done in other sports. They found similar results in elite cyclists after 11 weeks of strength training and improved by about 7% peak power output or mean power output over 5 minutes trial. So pretty much in line with what they found in elite cyclists.
And this is in line with a lot of the other strength training research that is actually out there. One of the things that always comes up that I want to kind of get your perspective on is whenever you do a strength training intervention study where strength training is laid on top of either what the athletes are already doing or a standardized training protocol that both groups are doing, what a lot of people will say, and I look at some of the strength training research with this eye as well, is just listen, group 2, the strength training group, is just doing more total physical work. And usually when we come down to training, just as sort of volume conversation kind of alluded to earlier, usually just more work results in more adaptation, even if it's not specific or well programmed or whatever. That's kind of like the big hammer, is just the volume of work. And I was wondering if we could kind of just get like your perspective on that, meaning if we just layer this on, is it the layer of extra work that is potentially producing some of the adaptation? Or if we could somehow, and there's been some research on this, where you try to equate for the effort or for the kilojoules or for the workload or whatever, how does it actually, is it a more effective or more efficient form of activity to actually improve an athlete?
Yes, it's a very valid point and very practical. Everybody that works in practical settings would have that perspective, and I totally agree. Actually, we are working on a manuscript that tries to bring forward the limitation of a lot of research, having interventions and then not matching or not acknowledging the fact that training load is not matched between the training group and the control group. I think there is an important component there from a training volume perspective, which it is hard to address, because if you were to increase equally the running volume from the control group, you may well incur in highly increased risk of injuries because of the sudden increase of 1 hour 30 of running per week in athletes that are running maybe 5 hours per week. So it's probably like 25% more volume all of a sudden. So from a practical perspective, it is quite tricky managing that. There are a couple of studies that matched the training volume between control and training, and they still found an improved performance and economy in the training group. But there is a confounder there due to the volume that differ between the groups. The adaptations will be different, so I would still expect some positive effects from the strength training, because you're working on capacities that are not developed in running. As we said, increase the force from a single fiber perspective, increase the stiffness, all these factors that are relevant from a metabolic perspective, which they don't usually get developed if you just do 2 extra easy runs during the week. On the other hand, if you have these 2 other short runs each week, you may get better in your lactic threshold, for example. So they target different systems, and I think striking the balance is important. So when I work with athletes, if they have more than 3 times per week, then they will have a strength session. If they only can train 3 times, then it's just running. And then the second session can be added if they have maybe 6, 7 sessions per week. So there'll be maybe 5 and 2. So that is a very practical perspective on the topic, which may be helpful for the listeners.
Okay, so I wanted to expand on this concept of how strength training can actually affect durability, because I know a lot of athletes have questions about it. And we've talked previously in this podcast about how volume can affect durability, how specific workouts like progression runs can affect durability. And so I wanted to get your perspective on this, Sarah, from how do you actually program things like this from a strength training perspective? And how do you just view this overall in terms of how it can be integrated into an athlete's program?
Yeah. So when it comes to strength training and durability, first and foremost, we're not going to be doing anything in the gym to specifically try to overcome something that you should be doing in your actual run training. Meaning, we're not going to do a bunch of step ups to try to get you as a better mountain climber. But what I focus on with my athletes is not only the volume of their strength training, the specificity of the exercises, but I also like to lean on things like plyometrics and isometrics for muscle and tendon stiffness, which I think can be really, really valuable with the durability of ultra runners, especially in longer distances. It packs a lot of punch, especially isometrics, for a lot less risk and a lot less volume necessary. So there's a great exchange of durability there.
And just to make sure that everybody understands what you're talking about, what would the exercises and I was going to use set rep combination, but the time under tension actually look like in those with that program?
So like a plyometrics, you can do something as simple as, as like low skill as like pogo hops, pogos. And then you can go all the way up to like depth box jumps and things like that. I think that people starting with something very simple, like an assisted plyo or pogo jumps, 2 sets of 20 seconds with 20-second rest can be very, very effective. When you're talking about isometrics, I like to do things called overcoming isometrics, which are the push or pull. So you're actually doing like a mid-thigh rack pull, something like that. So you're actually resisting the weight. You're not just holding a wall squat, which is fine. But when you're doing something like an overcoming isometric, you're not going to be holding for very, very long. We're talking 1 to 10 seconds at times. And you're going to be doing maybe 5 to 6 max of those with rest in between. So it doesn't take a lot. And you're not doing a lot of joint movement. Hence, it's an isometric. In that case, there's no joint movement really, but you're really going to be putting a good stress on the tendons and the muscles with low risk in terms of skill and or overuse.
So I want to bring Coach Adam in once again from like the programming side of things, because Adam, you kind of work in the capacity where you're working with athletes that are integrating strength training into their programming, as well as you're trying to help orchestrate the strength training at the same time. It's a little bit of a weird position for an endurance coach to be in. And I was wondering to get a little bit more insight into just more off your workflow when you're trying to organize the run training, the strength training, what the strength training load is going to be. Like, how does that just generally pan out for you when you're doing this with athletes?
Yeah, well, the first thing that I do with my athletes is that I really want to set the priority level and make that pretty clear. And that kind of dictates how we're going to bring strength training into the program. So a lot of people will finish a race. My legs blew up at the end. My quads were dead. And therefore, they are not strong enough. And I need to increase the strength. And while Michele's research is compelling, that strength training is a way to address that. As we've kind of alluded to before, there's other bigger priorities. So I want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to get those bigger priorities, and then we can layer in the strength training. And to dive into that a little bit, the first goal is always to make sure that the strength work doesn't interfere with the run work, or at least very minimally so. And then you can get the benefits, hopefully, from both programs. And you're getting your durability from a lot of great run volume and training, and you're also getting a little bit from the great strength work you're doing as well. And they can live in harmony.
I kind of want to get the live in harmony piece and give Sarah the final word on this, because we talk about this a lot in terms of how to integrate strength training and run training at the same time so that one doesn't compromise the other. Can you really quickly synopsize that for us, Sarah? What does that, is there a potential compromise, and how do you actually view trying to navigate it?
Absolutely. If the strength training is impairing an athlete's ability to do the primary focus, which is the run training, meaning they're constantly fatigued, having dead legs, don't have the time for it, then it's not going to work. So that means we need to look at how often are we doing it? We may need to shorten the duration, and we may need to take away a day. So for instance, a lot of folks come to me and they're like, I want to do 3 days a week of strength. I want to do 4 to 5 days a week of strength. Great in the early season. But as we progress and as volume increases, we're probably going to have to start taking some of that strength off the table so that you're not constantly in a fatigue state. And that might mean reducing from 4 days a week to 2 days a week, or from 3 days a week to two, possibly even to one as we get closer to an event. We can still focus on the main lifts. We can still focus on some great volume there, but just feathering in like how much strength training is or is not either enhancing or taking away from the run programming.
Yeah, and then the other practical perspective, especially for a lot of the regular athletes out there, they're normally adding strength training on top of what they are doing without regard to load management. For right or for wrong, that's a topic for another day, whether you need to take off some run load management if you're going to add strength training and things like that. But from a practical perspective, when most normal athletes want to deploy a strength training program, they don't change their running programming. They run 5 days per week, and they're going to strength train 2 times per week in the evening or the opposite time of day that they normally run. They're like literally doing it in the way that you've set up the research design is you have the group that's normally training, and then the group that has the parallel training with the addition of the whole addition of adding a strength training component to it. That's not everybody, but that's a lot of people just in practice. So it becomes something that is, to use an earlier word that we went through, is it becomes ecologically valid because it's what's actually happening out in the field.
Yeah, I didn't think about it so far. I don't have that broad experience. You probably have much larger experience because of the volume of athletes you work with. But yeah, even from an elite perspective, that is usually what happens. If you can squeeze in a couple of strength sessions, you just do that. You're not going to take away running or swimming or cycling volume for it. You may maybe consider to reduce maybe the run from 1 hour to 45 minutes and then have the strength session afterwards. But you don't just remove that run altogether. That's my experience, at least.
For the coaches out there and the strength training professionals out there that are cringing a little bit, just to reemphasize, we're not advocating for actually doing that, because certainly if you're training at a very high volume or close to your maximum volume, adding in any sort of additional stress needs to come with a some sort of load management strategy. It doesn't matter whether it's strength training stress or even stress for heat training interventions that we do quite often, or even altitude. You need to have some sort of counterbalancing in the total amount of work that you're doing. We're not advocating for just layering it on. We're just saying that it happens to be that ends up practically what ends up happening with a lot of athletes.
Very good point.
Yeah. I appreciate your perspective here. We're gonna let you go. This has been really fascinating. I'm gonna queue up all of the things that we had discussed, including the Twitter threads that you put together. You're a good Twitter follower, or good Twitter follow with a lot of this stuff. I'll link those up in the show notes so the listeners can go and dig into those if they do choose so. But where can people find more about you and learn a little bit more about the work that you're doing?
Yeah, as you mentioned, I think Twitter would be the place. My @ should still be Mick Zanini, MICZANINI. Maybe double check. And then any research that I publish will be on ResearchGate as well under my name. So Michele Zanini. I don't think there's that many, so it should be easy to find. Not particularly active on social media, but as you said, I tend to post anything that I find interesting on X/Twitter every now and then.
Michele, thank you for the research that you're doing, and thank you for coming on the podcast. It's been really insightful for me.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. And thanks for the thoughtful questions. Really enjoyed the conversation.
All right, folks, there you have it. Much thanks to Michele Zanini, as well as CTS coaches Adam Ferdinandson, Fred Sabator-Pastor, and Sarah Scazzaro for coming on the podcast today, helping us unwind this concept of durability just a little bit further. I do think that in the future, this is going to be something that we continue to lean on in order to evaluate potential athletic performance, as well as something that we can train for in ultra running. As always, this podcast is brought to you without any sponsors or endorsements of any kind, and that's so that we can bring you the absolute best unfiltered and unbiased information. If you want to support this podcast, the best way to do it is to first, you can share it with your friends and your training partners, and second, you can subscribe to Research Essentials for Ultra Running, our research newsletter, where we look at topics just like this and we unpack them just a little bit further with our crack team of physiologists and coaches to explain these things in much greater detail. If you're a coach, you're a practitioner, or you're an athlete that wants just a little bit more information that is available in these podcasts, check out that newsletter, Research Essentials for Ultra Running, and you're sure to get your fix of ultramarathon science content. That is it for today, folks. And as always, we will see you out on the trails.